Yeah. Okay. Welcome everyone to the First Community Choice Center. Thank you all for taking time out of your last schedule. 20 years here today. We're all celebrating Recognition Day. Very glad to be here. A lot of people joining all and everything. The first Community very cognizant of the J.J. Holiday and trying to do our holiday. With the social activities all over. We're here at Choice Center. We're not quite on campus, but we're still on the park social and create programming. Today, we're listening to our panel on how we're going to go here. Exploration of body so I like movement. We have panelists today, subject matter experts in different areas of civil rights movement. We're going to have a great discussion. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Alfred Young. Dr. Young is the editor-in-chief, leader professor, and chair of sociology, Department of Michigan. He's also a Harvard professor, Department of Sociology. That's a really big professor. He's also African Studies Department. He's with Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and he's associate director of the Center of Social Solutions. I'm really appreciative of him taking time to lead the conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Young. He's going to introduce the panel and take the discussion here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for attending this event. It is, in my mind, perhaps the most important of all the events that happen that is sponsored by the University of Michigan, because unlike so many of the events, this one is about coming to community. Right? We're not in Ann Arbor, we're here. And it is vitally important that if we act upon all that we think about, all that we're taught about in terms of Martin Luther King and his dream, it's about connecting the people where they are. Not just theorizing about them on campus. I do that for a living, I get that. But coming to places that are closer to concerns, to issues, to questions, that's what this session is all about. And so I will say very little other than to inspire this panel to talk about who they are, where they're from, and how those relate to enacting a future that continues to build upon, advance upon, in ways that they may present to us, and able to discover unfinished work to do around Martin Luther King's dream. Our gathering today, where do we go from here, is based upon the notion that the civil rights movement has accomplished a great deal. However, the work is not done. It remains a number of unnecessary challenges to many Americans finding equality of opportunity. Pregnancy discrimination, rape bias, human trafficking, police brutality, work discrimination against LGBTQ and disabled people run rampant in American society. So today we come to convene about how we can make progress. Share ideas from our panel, get ideas and questions from the audience. The intention is for me to launch the conversation with a few questions of our panelists, but then for you to please step in with questions, with challenges, with ideas, with your interests, so we can truly act upon this notion of coming to community to talk about new possibilities. That being the case, a very distinguished panel I'm pleased to have joining me on this platform. First, to my immediate left, Kendrin Somerville. Professor Somerville is Associate Professor in the Department of Nutritional Science at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. She's a registered dietitian, behavioral scientist, and public health researcher whose research focuses on the prevention of eating disorders and weight stigma. She used weight-inclusive framework to study how to promote health and well-being without inadvertently increasing body dissatisfaction, disordered eating, and internalization of weight bias. To our left, Mark Fancher, staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project of the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan. His cases and projects address abusive police practices, racial profiling, racial discrimination in public employment, mass water shutoffs, racial harassment of students, use of indigenous peoples' imagery and names as brands and mascots, and other matters affecting communities of color. I'm not sure what's left. Mr. Fountain is formerly senior staff attorney for the Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice, where he specialized in workers' rights. He served on the staff of the State Bar of Michigan from 1998 to 2000, where he coordinated projects to encourage greater pro bono participation by Michigan lawyers. He was a visiting assistant clinical professor at the University of Michigan Law School from 1996 to 1998. And to our left, Mel Baggett, retired after 36 years, was formerly employed as Vice President of Human Resources at Severstal, NA. He began his career with Ford Motor Company and worked in several divisions before coming to the Rouge Steel Company, then an affiliate of Ford. He has served in a variety of human resources, employee relations, union affairs, and benefits planning positions, and facilitated the company's spinoff to an independent enterprise. Similarly, he helped manage the transition when Severstal acquired Rouge Steel out of bankruptcy, and he was instrumental in the formation of an innovative collective bargaining agreement that helped sustain the business. As I said in the beginning, we have a panel of people that cover the vast and broad terrain around social justice and the possibility for new opportunities. So without further ado, I want to step into the conversation, invite our panelists to first of all address the question of where from your professional sectors is the agenda unfinished? What will you posit, even if we're not at solutions yet, and maybe by Tuesday we'll get there, but just by way of launching the conversation, what do you envision to be the work that has to be done, quite specifically in the sector you've been a part of, that you continue to be a part of?
I'm happy to start. So I'm a dietitian by training. I work in public health now, but I came to public health after working in hospitals and seen harm. My area of research is in weight bias, and I observed how people in thinner and fatter bodies are treated really differently. And that is what inspired me to do the research that I do. But in terms of, I can't remember the beautiful way you framed the question, but like, where is the work undone? I think it's in the people who are making decisions about how people get trained. It never occurred to me that our healthcare professionals are given standardized patients. They work on cadavers when they're training. They read case studies, and often the way that they're trained is on what's called quote unquote default patients. And we think about what is a quote unquote default patients. These folks often inhabit privileged identities. They're often thin patients, white patients, English-speaking patients. And the fact that our trainees are not trained to do pelvic exams on fat bodies, and again, I always defer to weight bias because that's my area. But I think there are ways in which our medical schools and other professional schools need to be training people to treat all people, not just people that are actually more likely to look like them. It's much easier to treat someone that looks like you because you have shared experience, and to be in a position where you're working on perhaps the hardest bodies to treat or the people that are least like you. That's what's making people better healthcare professionals, and it's just not addressed enough in training.
Let me first of all protect myself by saying that when I start talking about Dr. King, I have viewpoints and opinions that are not necessarily endorsed by my employer. So I'm speaking for myself.
Co-sign that.
And, I think that the genius of Dr. King is that even as far back as 1967, he had a pretty good read on the U.S. and its predicament and where it needed to go. And I think the best way to honor him is to not lose that. It's to hone in on exactly what his analysis was, where he was trying to go, and for us to pick up that baton and try and get there for him. He wanted to get to the promised land, and I think so far we've been wandering around in the desert because we have not taken a cue from where he was trying to go. And what he did is he identified three great evils that plagued this country. One was militarism, one was poverty, and one was racism. I won't deal with the militarism aspect of it now because it doesn't concern directly my work, although I think indirectly it does. But I think with respect to poverty and racism, that impacts what I do very directly. And what he understood, even though it's never talked about, is that the capitalist system was a stupid system. It was a vicious system. And that what was needed in this country was a radical redistribution of wealth. And until we get to that point where we appreciate that fact, then we are forever doomed to, linger in that place where he was back in 1967 and 68. And what's not known is that he was planning at the time of his death the Poor People's Campaign, which was not to be a picnic, on the mall in Washington. He was mobilizing thousands and thousands of poor people of all races, all ethnicities, to converge on Capitol Hill and to take over the government. They were going to occupy congressional offices, and they were not going to leave until Congress passed an economic Bill of Rights, which would ensure the most basic things for poor people: healthcare, employment, housing, all of the things that we've talked about all the time, but the government would guarantee it. He was going to fill the District of Columbia hospitals, the corridors, with the poor who were sick, and they were not going to leave until they had received treatment. And the Economic Bill of Rights would ensure that they would get continuing health care. Anti-war activists had been recruited to go over across the river and to occupy the Pentagon and to shut it down until the war came to an end. So when you see what he was trying to do, we understand very clearly why he was killed. And so I think that, his blood screams out for us to finish that agenda. And I think it has implications for so many of the things that we're trying to accomplish. All of the police violence and police terror that we have seen over the last several years, which has always been present in this country, let there be no mistake about that. It's just that it has been televised now because those who are part of the revolution are able to televise it. And so, that is a function of the fundamental racial problem that this country has never been prepared to accept and identify, recognize, and address. So I think that generally speaking, where we need to go is to follow the roadmap that Dr. King laid out for us.
After hearing that great introduction by the moderator, I was saying to myself, okay, what are you going to say next? But at the end of that resume was a crossroads for me. I was getting ready to retire. I was wondering what retirement would hold for me. And I had been involved in my own way in the civil rights movement, in working with affirmative action issues at Ford Motor Company and then successor companies. And I had been a lifetime member of the NAACP for a long time. But when somebody said to me that slavery existed in Detroit today as a product of the Detroit public schools and as a Detroiter and as a Wayne State graduate, I said, my Detroit, slavery exists today. And it was in the form of human trafficking. And I always thought of myself as a pretty well-read guy, pretty intelligent guy, but I had no understanding. I thought human trafficking existed in Cambodia or China or Eastern Europe or someone else. When I heard that no, it exists in Detroit, I said, I've got to do something about this. I've got to be part of a solution. And for the 8 or 9 years now that my wife and I and our group have been involved in this, we have seen a lot happen, and a lot has happened with regard to awareness. More people have heard about human trafficking today than 8 years ago. But it's one thing to become aware, it's another thing to do. And we call our organization, when we run Night Angels, we call them boots on the ground. We are going and looking for human trafficking victims, and we're trying to get them back to the purpose, the real purpose for their lives, which is being a victim of human trafficking. So although now a lot of people know about this scourge of slavery, There's few people really doing something about it. And I think in the memory of Dr. King, for people to rise up and say, now it's time, okay, we know about this. We always deputize people when we're giving awareness sessions, we deputize them to be abolitionists. We have them raise their hand and we deputize them. If those people would rise up and now get involved doing something, whatever it is, however it can be done, and we'll give you a model to do that. But that's where the work now lies in my mind.
So, Mr. Baggett, you almost stepped into my follow-up question. If there's more you can say, sure, I'd like to have the others as well. And that's a call to ground your vision in Detroit in particular. What do you envision the work that needs to be done in this city, for this city, by residents of the city, by partners with them?
Well,
Again, Mr. Giovanni.
sure. We have a team of 28 people in our team, in our non-profit. It's called Line 8. And we go to the city, we look for human trafficking victims. We've met over 3,000 trafficking victims over the last 8 years. A little group of 28 people. That's what needs to be done. We need to reach out and find victims are everywhere. My wife and I go to the airport, we go to a shopping mall, we go to a picnic, a outdoor swimming pool. It doesn't matter. We see human trafficking victims. And it's gonna take people involved and engaged to reach out to them and be able to see them as our team members see them and to say, let me help you. We have little cards, we have little business cards with a 1-800 number that we have to give them a card and say, call us. When you can call us, we will help. Well, everybody, many more people need to be able to do that if we're really going to fight off and chew this problem in a demonstrable way.
Well, from my perspective, Detroit has a number of problems that are screaming out at me all the time. And underlying most of them is the wholesale gentrification of the city. The fact is that, I'm not from Detroit. I grew up in Tennessee and I came here. And so I bring a different sort of perspective, a detached sort of perspective. And what I see is a Black mayor who, for a very long time, ran the city extremely well, and who left the city in very sound fiscal condition, ensured the establishment of, Black power with lowercase, opportunities for local residents. I saw a city that for generations had provided opportunity for people who had escaped oppression in the South to come north and to establish a very solid middle class. And I saw a lot of white resentment about all of this stuff. And I saw a lot of white people leave the city. And I saw a lot of white people with money hovering around the perimeters, waiting for this powerful Black mayor to somehow lose his control and his grip on the city so that they could come back in. And I think that's exactly what happened. And they came back in and they began a long process of trying to make the city unlivable. Redlining it, destroying institutions like the Recorder's Court, getting control of publicly owned property, locking it down so that nobody else can get it. Foreclosing on homes and forcing people out. And, once all of that is in place, putting in place somebody who's going to usurp the political power and the political will of the local residents, specifically in the form of an emergency manager who comes in and takes control of the reins of government, and then basically locks the city down and makes it safe for the people who for a long time had wanted to take control of it to come back in. And notwithstanding the fact that these same people, for years and years, had said that there's no money to rebuild Detroit, there's no money to rebuild Detroit. As soon as they've got control of it, for them to come back in and to pour billions and billions of dollars into it, and to rebuild it into a place that is unrecognizable for those of us who were able to see it just a decade or so ago. And meanwhile, the people who are part of what has been traditional Detroit are increasingly marginalized and pushed out and forced to leave, to make way for the gentry, to make way for a different class of people who can come in and to be part of this vision for Detroit. That's a crime, in my view. And I think that what's so frustrating about it is that it's like a major locomotive that's going down a track, with a lot of people who want to resist it, they're standing on the tracks hoping that they can stop it, and they just are absolutely powerless to do that. So, that's sort of a reality that I see for the city, and it manifests in a couple of different ways. One of the things that I mentioned is that people are being driven out of the city. One of the things that I'm working on right now is one of the tactics, and I really believe it was a tactic to drive people out, is mass water shutoffs. Thousands and thousands of people have lost their water service because of alleged non-payment of water bills. If you dig down, you find out that a lot of these people who were not paying wanted to pay, but couldn't because Detroit Water and Sewerage Department wasn't sending them accurate bills. They were guessing about the bills. They were billing them for services and water that they weren't receiving. They were making all kinds of errors, and so a lot of them are that way. There are a lot of people who were receiving bills that they just simply couldn't pay because they're living on fixed incomes. They're elderly. They're disabled temporarily or permanently. They're chronically poor or chronically unemployable for various reasons. They just couldn't afford to pay. And rather than adopt a water affordability program that would make it possible for them to pay, in other words, a billing scheme that indexes the bills to the actual income of the home, which is something that many major cities do. They have steadfastly refused to do that and have instead resorted and relied upon water shutoffs. So the ACLU, in cooperation with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and a number of local organizations and local attorneys, filed a lawsuit which is pending right now in federal court to enjoin or to stop the use of mass water shutoffs. That case, as I said, is pending, but in the face of it, in response to it, the city adopted an affordability program, which is not on sound footing yet, financially and administratively. And because they've got this program that they've created, have said that even though COVID has not been finally resolved, they plan to resume use of water shutoffs. And they have resumed them technically as of the first of this year. Because they say that now people have an opportunity to avoid shutoffs by enrolling in their program. We have a motion that we filed to enjoin them from doing that, which is going to be heard a week from today. So in terms of what specifically people can do, we certainly invite people to, support that, to be present for the hearing if possible. And that's just with respect to water shutoffs. Don't get me started on police.
So in terms of what Detroit needs, again, I'm paraphrasing your question. So I want to start by saying I don't live in Detroit. And as a white woman, I don't pretend to think it's appropriate for me to say this is what a community that doesn't look like me, that I don't represent, in neighborhoods I don't live, that I know best for that community. So I want to start by saying that there's so much history of harm that's caused by people who train in Ivy Towers and think that they know best. I know, there's things that I know and there's so much that I don't know. And I think if you're studying a community that you are not you don't live there, you don't work there, you don't worship there, then your job is to listen. And this is, I think, where physicians get it wrong and public health gets it wrong, that they decide that this is the priority for this community. And it may be a priority in terms of sort of an academic paper, but if it's not what matters in the lives of people who live there, then we're serving kind of our own desires and not actually there to help people. This is precisely why I study weight bias, because I think public health is so focused on the body size of people, the body size of children, and are losing sight of maybe what's much more important in the context of people's daily lives, and that's food security, water security, safety, thinking about the extent to which our guidelines are appropriate for the people that we try to force our guidelines on. Like, are the foods that we're recommending, are they available? Are they culturally appropriate? Do they bring joy to communities? I think any public health or medical intervention has to center the people that we're hoping to help, and sort of making sure the priorities are aligning in that way.
As I hear you all speak, I hear at least one common theme across the comments, and that has to do with better recognition of what's going on. And I find that important because where I sit, and I didn't say it before, I'm an urban sociologist. I study African Americans, particularly men in cities. I've been fascinated by the extent to which Detroit is so thoroughly misrecognized in so many ways. A set of stereotypes or interpretations loom large, and whether it's human trafficking or approach to a price like access to water, response to dietary practices that go to the body. There's a lot of folks out there that just don't know what's going on. And so I'm compelled to ask you to think about what kinds of work, whether it's financing initiatives, whether it's social organization, what might have to go into play to get a more appropriate recognition of what's happening on the ground in Detroit, given the issues that you addressed, given the concerns you addressed. How do we create a stronger public understanding beyond this of what's going on?
I need to think for a second. Someone else wants to start.
Well, I think tragically, there is pretty good understanding of what's going on in Detroit, but a very cynical and vicious response to that understanding by a lot of people outside of the city. I think they know that what's being done in the city is reclaiming the city for white people. I mean, just to put it bluntly. And they know that, and they like that, and they have no problem with it. Because we in the effort to I've talked about the water crisis. In our discussions about that publicly, the responses that we get are very mean-spirited. If they want water, they ought to stop buying flat-screen TVs and pay their bills. If they want water, they can always go down to the river and get some. If they want water, they can go to the store and buy some. I mean, that's sort of the attitude. They know. And so I think there's widespread awareness, and I think that among people in the city, I think they know it too. And I think that the problem is that they are voices crying in the wilderness. I mean, they organize, they make their best efforts, but there's just not the resources to stop this locomotive train that's coming. So, again, to refer to Dr. King, I think that the crisis that not just the state faces, but the country faces, it's a moral crisis, and he called for a revolution in values. I hate to say it, but I don't see any real hope until people are prepared to revisit the question of whether they're really acting like human beings, whether they do recognize the humanity of people who are being ground up and crushed by this very greedy and racist train that's running down the track, or whether they want to acknowledge people as brothers and sisters and to join in community to try and ensure that everybody prospers and everybody lives a decent life. And I think that it really becomes almost a spiritual question. And I think in many ways at the place where Dr. King was, where he thought that this country was rapidly approaching spiritual death. And it may have already gotten there on so many levels. And, you know, what a hopeful note.
Well, and I'll join in on a hopeful note in that I think Dr. King wanted the truth. He wanted the truth to be said by all. And with regard to human trafficking, we're afraid to talk about this issue on any meaningful level. With parents don't want to talk to their kids about it, pastors don't want to sit in the pulpit and talk about it. Our government doesn't want to talk about it because they're part of the problem. I mean, I can point fingers all around the room, but if we all knew what was driving the greed, human trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. If we knew who was driving it and why they were driving it, and starting with pornography, I'll take that as the first bite, but you know, pornography is the largest user of human trafficking victims that there is. And I just want to say to anybody out there, anytime you click that mouse on a pornographic website or watch pornography, you are fueling the world of the evil of human trafficking. And if people understood that, if they understood the truth, they understood what's driving this slavery, then they might stand up and say, enough is enough. Or with regard to housing, with regard to any of the other social ills that Dr. King was trying to deal with. If we heard the truth and we don't get it from the biased media, but somehow someone can stand up and tell us what is really going on, then we could stand up and really help. And that's what we need, is help in the world of human trafficking. We need help in dealing with it on so many levels. We need those boots on the ground.
I was hoping I would come up with something wise to say as I was listening to my panel members. I think I share some of the pessimism that's been expressed up here of people know, right, that this is not sort of a secret how health inequities exist in our state, in our country, in all sorts of places. And I sort of go back to thinking about who are in positions of power and privilege and who are decision makers. And I think the extent to which people who are working in public health and in medical fields actually look and reflect the communities they work in. I think that's our hope. And I don't want to think a future or a generation or two down the road, but that's sort of what I'm thinking. I think a lot about workforce development because I work in a dietetics training program, and how can we diversify who is actually in positions of power, who is working in communities, because I think that type of representation at all positions of power and privilege, that's when I think real change can happen, because it's the train is fast, has a lot of inertia. I'm not a physicist, I don't know what words to use there, but it's hard to slow that, right? And to sort of change who's aboard that train is slow, but I think that's the approach we need to take.
Let me suggest at least one thing that I think does offer hope. And that is that we have, over the generations, been trained to think of our community as very local. And I think that as long as Detroit sees itself only in local terms, then there isn't much hope, because there just isn't the type of power that's necessary to overcome the external power that has descended on the city. I think that increasingly, the oppressed, wherever they are, have to see themselves as part of the global community of the oppressed. And as long as you see it from that perspective, then you have a whole lot more power and a whole lot more potential to overcome these forces of reaction than we have as long as we're just small little minority communities. And the potential is there. And I think that the struggle for people is to overcome the propaganda that trains them not to look in the direction of potential allies. We hear endless propaganda about Fidel Castro in Cuba and the whole Cuban Revolution, terrible, bad, evil, horrible. Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, terrible, off. But if you really look at the responses of those, and those are just two examples. I mean, there are other places around the world. You look at how they have tried to relate to oppressed communities in this country. And if you don't let that propaganda blind you, you begin to see potential allies, all right? You know, when Katrina struck, you know, the Cuban government immediately mobilized hundreds and hundreds of doctors and had them ready to get on planes to come in to Louisiana to provide emergency health care and to respond to that crisis. And then President Bush wouldn't allow them to come. You know, Venezuela was prepared and did provide heating oil to poor communities and to poor households at almost no cost, at a time when the cost of heating oil was very high. The Cuban medical school has always made itself available to young people from this country, from oppressed communities, who want to go and get a free education, free medical education at the Cuban government's expense, as long as they promise to come back into the United States and practice medicine in oppressed communities here. You know, when we begin to think about where our potential allies are around the world, and I just use those as two examples, there are others, and we establish a relationship with them and regard them as part of our community, rather than thinking that the only hope that we have is of winning local elections and trying to get Congress to respond and all of that. As long as we begin to basically recognize that we're dealing with an empire, an oppressive capitalist empire whose whole job is to crush communities that are oppressed, and we are in league with and working with actively those communities which are fighting against imperialism and fighting against oppression, our prospects for success go way up.
I think to build on what you said, and you didn't want to talk about the cops, but I'm going to talk about it.
Oh, go ahead. 'Cause I'm gonna talk about it.
When we started our street outreach and trying to help human trafficking victims who are sex workers in the city of Detroit, we were harassed by the police. You cannot believe the harassment that we suffered from them, shining the lights in our face, telling us how we were stupid white people in the city trying to do anything. I mean, I could go on and on and on. But there was a point where it tipped. And they became enlightened. And we actually got invited to meet with the captain of the Detroit SVU unit. And we met with the captain of the Detroit SVU unit, and we told him what we did. And there was a panel of other people just like us talking about this issue. And that pendulum began to swing. And now they sort of watch over us now while we're on the streets. They don't necessarily see sex workers as criminals. And I won't repeat the things they called them, you know, that I've heard cops call our sex workers that we call our friends on the street. But that has all changed now. And I think Detroit has become, you know, sort of a champion where other suburbs are beginning to look at the way that Detroit is doing their business in the area of human trafficking and emulate what they're doing. Now our problems are with the suburban chiefs of police who don't see human trafficking as a problem. They don't even think of it being able to exist in their city, or that people who live in their cities end up coming to Detroit and working, you know, in a human traffickers controlled world. So Detroit has become an luminary a little bit in this way. So I think maybe there is some hope.
Well, thus far, you've been astute observers. Now it's time to engage in conversation. I welcome comments, questions. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Gloria Davis, and I am a 7-decade resident of Detroit. I have seen what you were referring to. I've watched the changes. Let me first of all say that I pay $300 a month. I generally 9 months out of the year for water. And just recently, we were assessed, or recommended that we purchase this insurance for our sewer lines that break down. So, you know, I always believe, you know, when you talk about the power who's in power, you know, when you follow the money, okay, where's this money going? Just like all of these speed humps. You know, why suddenly do we have speed humps in practically every community, every neighborhood in Detroit? But when you walk across 8 Mile or across Telegraph, you don't see them. So, you know, and I'm certain everybody's speeding somewhere. You know, and somebody's dog got hit in the street somewhere. But nonetheless, I question some of that. And I'm blessed because I'm able to pay my bill. Okay, I am a retired Detroit public school educator, and I also serve on a committee that we call the Urban Council Workshop, which we're doing a workshop March 21st. And human trafficking is one of the issues that was brought up that has to be done simply because the state asked. You know, see, so as counselors, and that's who our audience will be, counselors with a few K-12 counselors, a few college counselors, and et cetera, you know, my question is, I can only do so much. So you're talking about being able to identify thousands in the last 8 years. How can I tell which child in the building is out there homeless? Excuse my language. Okay, because that's what you said they're doing, basically. But they're in school. So, and how has it become my role? Because as a counselor, even though I care about my children, or I did anyway, I don't work anymore, but I encourage those, because I train counselors, I encourage all of them to, you know, you gotta love them just like they came out of the other womb. You gotta love them. But so how can a counselor understand their particular role? You know, the state says it's our role. The state has mandated it down that they have to have training. Counselors have to have training in human trafficking and some other little issues that are related to that. But you're talking about being able to identify something, you know, how will counselors know that? And I don't stop them to charge me $300 because they say I got a lot of cash because I got a long drive.
You want to go first, sir?
Our council workshops have done that, and I'm one of the founding members. So we were on our 20th year celebration when the pandemic hit. So we are first year coming back in person. And by the way, we're going to the first mission this year. Go. Anyway, but one of the pieces that we got on the table is mental health and health practices for the counselors. Because, you know, everybody was concerned about how these children were coming back. Nobody even thought about the impact that these adults had. You know, both populations came back ill prepared. So that's your idea, your concept. And by the way, I did a dietitian and you don't tell me how to help.
I'll start. We, our 980 organization worked with the legislature. We advocated for a number of laws that were put in place. We call them the Teresa Flores laws, right? And there were a bunch of laws to try to make professionals in significant professions aware of human trafficking. And counselors is a group that is required under law to take human trafficking awareness training. Okay. And we helped do some of that training. We've assisted groups do that. And what it's intended to do is for you to understand the vulnerabilities. Vulnerability is what gives the trafficker the opportunity to target an individual and to groom them to become a victim. So what we're trying to do is to teach healthcare professionals, counselors, police officers now, I think they're now getting the training, but to give professionals to understand what those vulnerabilities are. Aging out in foster care system, coming from a home where sexual abuse occurs. You know, I can go on and on, but there's a number of vulnerabilities. And we're just trying to raise awareness So as a counselor, if you see these vulnerabilities, that you could probe a little bit, I don't think it's real hard for someone to figure out where the possibility could exist and then refer an individual or someone who has a lot more training than I do, and getting them the help that they need, that if they are trafficking victims or being trafficked, that you get around pegged into a round hole.
You know, the problem with that concern is, we have to refer to protective, child protective services, okay? So which means we don't take them out of the known, place them in the unknown. See, some children already know to go hide behind the sofa when the situation is going awry. Okay, so for me as a counselor, it can be very, very difficult. But that's what they say I have to do to protect them. Okay, foster care don't necessarily, or group homes aren't necessarily more protective environments, but that's the only answer as a school counselor that I have.
Well,
And in some cases, I'm sorry, and in some cases, when I do see those vulnerabilities, because we do see them, if you take some time to watch your children, you do see them, they'll shut down on you. Okay, which means, I don't have that opportunity to get in there to try to help them. And again, my answer is to take them away from the known places unknown.
well, the other side of the coin is that a trafficking victim sometimes can only last, being a human trafficking victim, for 6 months, 3 months. So sometimes they have very short windows, and I hate to say it, but sometimes the outcome is not. So that's got to be balanced, with your issue, and I understand it too. And I had, in fact, it was one of those SVU people that told me, sometimes when we put them in the CPS, we're putting them in what could be a worse situation than what they're coming from. And we can talk about that all night, but there's a balance issue. I understand your point. And hopefully the system can get victims to good resources so those things can be fair.
Let the other two panelists get a chance to respond. And the danger of being in the front row is you can't see how many hands behind you want to jump in. You gotta give those folks a chance too. But no. Again, being in the front row. As a professor, I appreciate it. The downside is there's some other hands you want to give to those folks. But I want to allow the panelists to respond if they have anything to say.
Yeah, just briefly. I'm really glad that they made a holiday for Dr. King, but it is really sort of in the tradition of U.S. culture, which identifies the great man, the great woman, and it builds up a belief that in the Messiah concept, that we wait on one person to come and do it. And, the reality is, as great as Dr. King was, he would have been nothing by himself. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people who mobilized and were behind him and made things happen. And so, very often when people call me and present problems to me, just to give you one example, a parent will call and say that my child has this problem in the schools. I need you to do something about it. My response is no, I can't do anything until you do something. I need you, first of all, to identify other parents who are having the same problem with their kids. I need you to mobilize them, get them in one place. I'll come meet with all of them. And, we'll plot a strategy together about how to deal with this, but you just send me into the school by myself, I can't do anything. So that's my response to, I'm more than happy to work on the issue, but I need organization. And, there are many people who are better qualified to be a Messiah than me, and I know I'm not. So organize, I'm there with you.
I'll comment briefly on the question you asked about mental health in kids. We are at a mental health crisis among young people that was perhaps a necessary consequence of the pandemic. Young people are meant to be with other young people in community in person, and the collective national trauma that we all experienced was hit different, or it hit different for kids at sort of developmental, like key times. They were just missing out on milestones and togetherness. And then you take that and add on top of that what they did with their free time. For many kids, it was being on a screen, because what the heck else did they have to do? Parents that were working could not be monitoring screens of kids. And the point you made about sort of like follow the money trail, social media companies made so much profit on advertising during the pandemic to kids, and they advertise and feed content to kids in a way that we know harms them. Right? Facebook, Instagram, we know that the more time, particularly adolescent girls, spend on those media, the worse they feel about themselves, the more eating disorders they have, the more depression that they have. This has been well documented in the pandemic, and that's what does it mean to come back? Because there's a lot of repair that has to be done, right? We can't just say pandemic's over. As I pulled my mask, it is most certainly not over. We can't just sort of move on. We have to repair and think about what did they lose? What did our young people lose? And how do we teach them to move forward, given that they're starting a few steps back in terms of their mental health and their connection and that type of thing.
I've got a lot of things to say, particularly this. I want to, in the interest of getting more audience participation, I just want to ask one big question. Is there still a role for nonviolent civil disobedience? And if so, what form might they take? That would be easy to discuss. Gene, why form?
I love that question. Here's my take on it. Tactics have to change. We find it's kind of hard for us to realize, but back at when, boy, danger of getting old is you forget names. The head of the Pullman Porters. Philip Randolph, yeah. Back when Philip Randolph was in that role, he went to Franklin Roosevelt, and he was making certain demands, and he said, unless you do this, I'm going to bring thousands of people to Washington, D.C. for a march on Washington. And Franklin Roosevelt freaked out. He was like, whoa, you don't do that. Don't do that. What can we do to try and appease you and try and get you to do it? He never had to have the march because the idea was so novel. It just, the threat of it just seemed so incomprehensible that he was willing to do anything to stop this march on Washington. So years later, when Dr. King had his march, they were still freaked out about the idea. And they had the National Guard on alert. They had buses lined up to take people to jail. They thought they closed down the federal government because they thought there was going to be mass, disorder and disruption and everything. We know that nothing happened. It was fine. And so, those tactics worked because they created a certain fear or concern about disrupting the status quo. And so they were effective. Okay, they're no longer effective. Okay, now if any movement says we want to stage a demonstration or a march, the police are thrilled beyond belief. City government is thrilled beyond. We'll help you. We'll clear the way. We'll have police out there for you. We'll have this. You want some water and some refreshments? Because they've got this down to a science. You use people. People in the community. We got to march. We got to march. Okay, and then what? Because it doesn't mean anything anymore. They've got this down to a science. They know exactly what to do. And even with other tactics involving, not violent. Resistance, civil disobedience, things, they got that down to a science too. They know exactly how to deal with it. And so I think we're at a stage now where we can't just say, well, it worked back then, so it should work now. We've got to figure out new ways to inconvenience and make the comfortable uncomfortable. Okay, whatever it is that you want to do, it may not involve marching or sitting in or any of those things, but whatever it is, it's got to be something that if it's done, it just freaks them out. They've never seen this before. It bothers them. It takes them out of their comfort zone. That's the kind of tactic that will make a difference. But I think that the thing that will really, really make a difference is that we move beyond mobilization and movement and, sort of engaging in this sort of piecemeal approach to trying to make change here and there, to developing really solid organization, permanent organization that's always there and it's always ready to do whatever is necessary in order to make the kind of change that you want.
Night Angels is a faith-based organization, or Christian-based organization. And I believe two things, that if white pastors and white churches would stand up and say the right things and to teach their congregants what is really meant by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, we'd have a much different world today. I think things would change immediately. And I think the church should rise up on social issues and take charge, because it's not working. The way we've tried it up to this point, enough. We need, the movement needs to be fueled, whether it's human trafficking or other social issues. I think the church is asleep at the switch.
Hello, thank you everyone. I'm really being informed today. I wanted to address Mr. Thatcher and ask him about the role of the media, because the role of the media in the city of Detroit seems to be one that doesn't serve the people of Detroit, but continually shines a negative light on Detroiters and promote the objectives of the oligarchs who want to do what they want to do. So it used to be a time when you looked at the media as the fourth estate. They promoted, after the bad guys. But the bad guys seems to be those who have all the money today and are doing what they're doing here today. So do you see any way that we can get traction, move forward as a community with the way that the media treats Detroiters and reports on the city of Detroit? Because they're no longer in the business, to me, of reporting and going after the bad guys. Their main thing is to shape perception. And it's always negatively, seemingly, about Detroit.
No, I think your analysis is right on point. And your reference to the period in history when it was the fourth estate was to a period when, newspapers were in essence comparable to what we now have as podcasts and blog sites and things like that, where, everyday people are able to, get hold of a printing press and begin to print newspapers or to leaflets and pamphlets and things, and they can be totally independent and totally honest. And so, to the extent that the media in those days was able to hold the powerful accountable, the powerful recognized this and bought up all the media. And so now the media has become essentially the public relations arm for corporate interests. And so I think that the first step is for us on a mass level to begin to recognize that that's who they are, and to adjust our expectations in terms of how they're going to cover stories and what they're going to cover, what they won't cover. And I think that once we begin to do that, then we begin to look at alternative ways of communicating among people that we need to communicate with, and to basically discredit the mainstream media, to really make it clear. And it's probably frustrating for idealistic young reporters who go into this and who want to do the right job and who turn in stories that are honest and truthful only to have those stories killed or edited down to meaninglessness or buried, in places where nobody ever sees or hears them. Maybe recruiting them, talking to them, trying to subvert the corporate media from, the inside. But I think that you're right on point. And we just have to figure out new ways to get the word out and communicate. And, it probably wasn't intended, but I think that the internet provides opportunities and has provided opportunities for truth telling that otherwise would not have been there if that had not been available.
Do others want to comment on that point?
Yeah, I think internet provide opportunities for truth telling, but also at the same time, opportunities for amplification of negative messages, salacious messages. Those get clicks, those get likes. And the incentive structure, if you are in a media company, is to print things that are salacious, right? Because that is what's making money. And so I think the incentive structure is exactly wrong within media companies with the loss of local papers and local reporting.
Yeah, I have a question for Ms. Sandra. Just out of curiosity, what are some signs, subtle signs, how would someone know they're being discriminated against because of their weight? In the workplace,
Yeah,
what are some signs or things to look for, pay attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question because weight bias pops up in so many ways, subtle and not so subtle. I mean, we think about like in a school setting, weight-based teasing and bullying is really violent and obvious, but there are ways in which things are maybe more subtly weight biased. I think a lot about weight bias in medical settings. And if you're someone that lives in a larger body, if you know you're going to get a lecture about your body size, that is weight bias. If you are withheld treatment because of your body size until you lose weight or you follow some rules, then that is weight bias. If you are getting procedures done on equipment that wasn't designed for your body, I think about blood pressure cuffs. We have a default. Again, default is sort of clue for racist or biased or something, right? When we think about default equipment, you're not getting the best possible care. And there's so many ways in which we sort of gatekeep within medical settings to say, we're not going to give you this procedure because your body is too large, or we're not going to give you this treatment, but someone in a thinner body would be offered it first. So if you feel like you're not given the best possible care, if you're fearing these conversations, if you're fearing these lectures, if you're made to feel less than because of your body size, that is weight bias. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question about how do we think about weight as something that is a contributor to health. And I mean, the first thing I'd say is that people of all body sizes deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And the extent to which like healthcare providers provide like a hostile place, people in larger bodies stop going to the doctors because doctors are dismissive. They spend less time in appointments. They provide less intervention, less rapport building. And so the way that the doctors provide care for high weight people makes their health worse. And so there are ways to provide health care that is equitable based on body size. And there are some health conditions that are weight related, probably not as weight related as we think, right? Because weight bias is part of the reason why people in larger bodies have worse health. It's because they are experiencing stress and discrimination and are being withheld procedures and services because of their body size. But lectures about weight is never causing change. And let's think about what's actually going to help people improve their health. And it may be completely independent of changing their body size. But I think it's the sort of blaming, shaming lectures that get in the way of having good conversations about health. A lot of it has to do with medical training. Yep. Doctors are trained to say, I know better than you. You certainly can't know about your health because of the way your body looks. And that is weight bias.
I want to go to that question. I want to add a very short story to this point that I think extends the whole issue of bodies and Black people and has a lot of bearing on Detroit. Very briefly, I teach a class on African-American men and masculinity. And the last time I taught it, given the topic, I had an unusual number of athletes in the classroom, Black football players. I had a guest speaker who was a sociologist who also played in the NFL for 3 years. So that was the day everybody was dialed in, an academic, but also a football player. And he did an activity where he asked a male and a female to courageously kind of stand up and talk about their bodies. So one of the football players got up, a black woman got up. And to hear people who will otherwise not be imagined as having the same concerns, right? The man who spoke to the NFL today, right? The woman, assume she's gone on to do everything she's gone on to do, but a celebrity in the making and a black woman, both talking about the challenges of managing their bodies in public space. The woman talking about her corporate interests and, you know, what she was doing around diet to make sure she looked like a safe black woman to be hired in corporate America. The athlete talking about his concerns, but how they also then spill over in how he navigates life on campus or any other space where he's a threat doing the very things he might do on campus that get celebrated as an athlete. And for me, you know, aside from diet, aside from the very real health concerns, there's just an agenda about black people and bodies that invites oppression, that invites stress, that invites anxiety, and to have this woman that's had in the same space talk about this, you know, which is so limiting, you know.
Yeah, anti-fatness is very much a relic of anti-Black racism. By the early 19th century, fatness was deemed evidence of racial inferiority and immorality, and this is something that well predated concerns about health, right? White people, and particularly white Puritans, decided that this was a way they could separate themselves from other bodies and justify enslavement and mistreatment of Black bodies. And so I appreciate you bringing up the point, the sort of connection with anti-fatness and anti-Black racism is, it is impossible to separate them because it's a way to justify mistreatment and poor care.
Yeah, I did want to ask, do you think this new recent body positivity movement, you know, like this whole love, it makes one and allows people to ignore the negative impact that weight has on health?
Mm-hmm. So I love that question. I actually do some research in the body positivity space. So we know that people, if they have a particular body size, the extent to which they're comfortable in the body, the better their health is. So you can actually be in a very large body if you feel comfortable and are not sort of worried about your body, your health is going to be better. So to some extent, the body positivity movement is actually pretty helpful in that way. Hating your body, feeling stressed about your body doesn't make you treat it better, it makes you treat it worse. And so I think there's some good fabrics in the, or sort of good threads in the body positivity movement. Where I think it falls flat is that it centers thin white women, right? And thin white women have capitalized off that movement at the expense of other more oppressed bodies. And so I think there's a lot of things that gets wrong, but the idea that you should feel good in your skin and you should do things that make your body feel good and move in ways that are joyful and fuel yourself with foods that serve you. I think there's a lot of benefits to that movement.
That all the issues dealing with diversity and racism and inclusion is always a topic. And all your allies come out on TV. Where are all the allies? Where are these discussions? And what do we do tonight? Because everybody will come to Detroit because they know that there's a racial issue, there's an historic racial issue. There's always something that needs to be discussed. But it comes down to Detroit, without Farmington Hill. Why aren't these discussions on the day other than the King Day? If that's the case, King Day was everything King was here. That's the discussion that needs to be discussed. And the allies need to talk to these communities among themselves. You don't need to have Black folks in those discussions when you are discussing these same things you're discussing now. You should discuss those things out there in those communities as well. And then we have those discussions. You take those to the core. Who are funding these things that are great in your race. Taking your property. See, this is a discussion that needs to be discussed all the time. But it doesn't have to always be a diverse group. the outlet, white ally, you talk to your other communities that are not here to hear the discussion. And these are topics that are in academia, in medicine. It's permeated everywhere. Today is not the only thing that needs to be discussed. It needs to be addressed all the time. Everybody needs to hear something uncomfortable, especially poor people, because they're not going to be here with us. They don't want to hear that. And a lot of these black organizations, they're implicit with us. They want their organizations funded. So they're not understanding that. When the black community, the black organizations, they give you song and dance, like everyone give you song and dance. Like you go to the, if you're going to the VA, the VA will give you a runaround. You go to the NAACP or you go to the early, they don't give you a runaround. Why? Because they're getting money from workers. They don't want to hear you guys say things. If corporates come to the NAACP, you will read up like they got a listening. They'll listen because they don't know. So the discussion is not for today. The discussion is every day. The discussion is not just among ourselves. You go into that CEO's office and you go into the that's not expected to bring that down to that CEO and discuss that with them. Let them do it, because like you said, you got to create a situation of uncomfortability. If you're always comfortable, things will remain the same. Maybe people feel uncomfortable. I lost the job because I made somebody feel uncomfortable. And then they deal with that to give you a relief. Because I did something because but I discussed with some of my coworkers. We all in the cafeteria, we done this, we done that. But when that day came out, there was no door. There was nobody behind me. So I had to kind of allow myself, I had no problem doing it. Because I know it was right. But they scared to stand up because they know they think they're one by one. But see, these people think get rid of me because I was there all by myself. So if you're different about by yourself, go in or you go down by yourself. Because they got to be something that you hear. And that's the problem. If you're not usually hearing nothing different.
Any strategies about having conversations in other spaces? How to make that happen?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right on everything you said. And what makes it more tragic is that for even those occasions when people are prepared to talk about race, they don't know what they're talking about. As a general matter in this country, speaking very broadly, we don't have a clue about what this racial problem is all about. Because nobody talks about it, nobody knows what to talk about, and when they talk about it, everybody gets all upset. I'm gonna talk about it. This country was founded by a small group of wealthy property white men. 4 white men alone, not even white women. It was for a small group of white men. And if you don't believe it, look at the Constitution itself. You can see language in there which tells the tale. That's who it was for. And what was recognized early on is that in distributing power and making sure that they preserve the power, that they faced the potential for losing their grip on the country if they were not able to pacify a large group of white people who were very, very poor. So especially in the South, in the early years of this country, the number of plantation owners, people think all white people were involved in slavery. They weren't. Because the cost of buying one enslaved African was in today's money sometimes as much as $10,000 to $20,000 to $30,000, which meant that if you were going to staff an agricultural force for your plantation, you had to have lots and lots of money. So very few families had that kind of money. The vast majority of white people in the South were desperately poor. The quality of their lives was only slightly better than that of enslaved Africans. The only difference sometimes is they got paid a few pennies where the Africans got paid nothing. all right? And so what do you do when you're a wealthy white man and you see the potential for an alliance between these poor whites and these enslaved Africans? If they wake up, if they realize that if they come together, that I, as a wealthy white man, member of elite, am finished. So we've got to drive a wedge between them. And so what you do is you create this artificial notion of white privilege, where you don't really give any material benefits to the poor whites, but what you do is you create for them an expectation that they will never be at the very bottom of the society, that they have potential for upward mobility within the society, whereas the enslaved Africans are always going to be stuck there, and they're never going to progress. And so if you're poor and you're white and you got nothing but the hope that maybe your kids can do better than you grab that, you cling to it. And so once they've got this group and their allegiance, then they begin to exploit and use them. So they stole the country from indigenous peoples, just stole it, lock, stock, and barrel. And you've got a whole bunch of indigenous peoples who are waging war against these occupying forces. And so what you do is you get these poor white people, you put them in uniforms and give them guns, and you go send them out to kill all of the indigenous peoples. You take these poor white people and you pay them money to be overseers on the plantation, because the enslaved Africans are at every opportunity plotting revolution, plotting rebellion and resistance, trying to overthrow the slave system. So you've got to have these white people interfering and intervening and playing that role. You use these poor white people to play the role of slave catchers, to track down runaways and to punish them and to abuse them. And they eventually evolve into police departments. And we still have those people now, all right? And so you've got this division. But then you've got a problem after abolition, because as soon as these enslaved Africans are freed, they do the miraculous. Their literacy rate goes up through the roof immediately. Because they've been wanting to read for so long. They find their way into state legislatures, especially in South Carolina, and they dominate them. You have Black lieutenant governors. You have Black enterprises. You have places where you have enslaved Africans who learn skills on the plantation, in order to provide carpentry services and building services and other things for the master. They leverage that and they turn them into businesses. They do all of these things and they begin to elevate themselves. And all of a sudden, their status is no longer at the very bottom. And you've got a lot of white people who are poor and who are losing their minds because they had a promise that they would never be on the bottom, and now they find themselves on the bottom. And so they have to redeem the South. And they enter into a period called redemption, which includes establishing the Ku Klux Klan, which they use to terrorize these people back into a submissive state. And so this is not an isolated incident historically. We see it repeat itself periodically. So that now, when we've got the prospect of white workers losing their way of life because corporations have made decisions to relocate their manufacturing jobs overseas, when they've made decisions that impact their opportunities for healthcare and education that are to their detriment, and their way of life is not what they thought it would be and what they would expect it to be, then all of a sudden they begin to lose their minds. Because now, not only are they at the bottom, but somehow this Black man found his way into the White House. And that was not supposed to happen in America. And so it makes it easy for a demagogue to step in and to say, I have come to save you, I am your Messiah. It is these Black people and these brown people who are causing your problems. And not only that, the demographers are projecting that they're eventually going to overtake you in terms of the population, and you're going to be the minority. And they're going to come and get you. You need somebody to protect you. I am the man to protect you. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to freeze the population growth right where it stands. It's growing because all of these brown people are coming across the border in the South. We're going to stop them from coming. We're going to build a wall. Now, these white workers know that that's ridiculous, and they really don't care, because at least they know that this man is their champion and has their best interests at heart. And so they are ready to ride and die with this man. No matter what he says, no matter what he does, he is the one that has come to save them. And, until we come to terms with these kinds of realities about race, and that being at the bottom of it, we can't have any meaningful discussions. We can't have any meaningful discussions until we're prepared to be honest about the fact that on a moral basis, the United States has no right to exist. I mean, it was stolen territory. There were civilized nations who were there. It has no right to exist. And it was built up off the backs of stolen African labor. It has no moral right. And so what do you do historically to correct that injustice? The thing that you do is you give the land back. Give it back. And that's unthinkable to most people. How dare you even suggest the idea that would cause such disruption? Well, you weren't concerned about disrupting the Cherokee Nation when Andrew Jackson went there, told these people who had been living in the Smoky Mountains for generations and who had advanced civilizations that they needed to relocate all the way to Oklahoma and leave everything behind. It wasn't too disruptive for them. You need to make sure that for everything that you have taken from enslaved Africans, even basic knowledge of who they are, where they come from. Most European immigrants, they can talk about the old country and they know all about their history and they know all of this. We've been deprived of even that most basic thing. We know nothing about our history or who we are. And so how do you compensate for that? Well, that would bankrupt the Treasury of the United States, bankrupt it. Justice demands it, because until you do justice, you can't even begin to start thinking about human beings living as civilized human beings in polite society.
Very briefly, I want to get, there's one more question. Yeah, there was a question there.
Yes, I had a question about, I'm curious on your thoughts about DEI within higher ed specifically. So I'm a faculty member at Henry Ford College. I also work with them. We bridge to the humanities programs, the students going there to them. And yeah, I just have mixed feelings and thoughts. So I'm just curious about just your thoughts about that, and also like what potential practical applications do you see for these roles like DEI officer in academia to actually make a change like in that particular space?
Was that directed to?
Anyone who would like to answer, yeah.
I've been running my mouth forever. So.
I'm trying to think how to best answer that. I think it has to be someone's job, right? We can't assume that we are teaching in an equitable way and that things are just going to run smoothly, because they don't. And when we assume things, the status quo is fine, the people that are, there are people that are harmed, and it's really predictable who is harmed. And so I think DEI initiatives can sometimes feel like a checkbox, like, yes, I went to this thing. No, I didn't go to this thing. And so I think that there's a lot of room for growth and DEI initiatives that really challenge people, right? If you go to DEI initiative and go in and out and feel like you had a good time, you did something wrong. And so I think that there's, it could be done better, but I appreciate that we have people in my school, public health, who are putting together curricula for folks like me who didn't get the training in, for example, anti-racist pedagogy, which I need, right? If I need to run a classroom, I have to be thinking about equitable teaching practices, and I'm trained to be a researcher, to be a statistician. I'm not trained to be a teacher who thinks about my classroom as a way that can convey a hidden curriculum and subtle inequities. And so I appreciate that there are people there who are offering me that guidance, but I think there's obviously a long way to go, because there's, again, a lot of repair, a lot of practices that are harmful that have yet to be questioned.
I'm going to put my HR hat on for a minute. As a retiree, most of my experience is no good anymore. But I think anytime you take an issue and you try to put someone in charge of it as a satellite to the organization, it has trouble taking traction throughout the organization in a way that you want it to work. You've got to look at making that thought process or that business process intrinsic to the organization, driving it down to the very lowest levels, teaching everyone the skill and knowledge that you want. you can't expect a person or even an office to do that. It has to become part of the culture of the organization, and making it part of the culture is really what we're looking for.
Last question.
I used to see snippets of it on YouTube, but I believe it's all verbally time. And then, documentary that was made, not all Dr. King was killed. And I think they were dealing with a church that was integrated into the system of Omaha, Nebraska, remember, right? And after King was killed, some Catholic did in the church, the Catholic church, they wanted to integrate church, and they wanted to find out if the Christians were going to go along with it. So they debated among themselves, and they had a preacher go to the black community to discuss it. When he came back to the white church, some of the members, some of the hierarchy in the church, didn't think it was a good idea. The point that I want to make is the fact that at the time of King died, there was an issue about racism and racial. The same system from 68, fresh activists murdered, to now, we're still debating the same issue. The result of people in the church that wanted to integrate. They made the pastors leave the church. Some of the congregants decided to leave the church. Some of the churches in the black community, they were up for it, but they didn't really trust it at that time. But it's just the dynamics from 68 to now. The dynamics haven't changed. The issues haven't changed. The only thing that changed was the time. So we're still going to have that issue. None of that's something that's basically redone. In other words, the way we're doing it now, or the way we've been doing it, is now working. Some of us realize that, but refuse to make that step to reverse for whatever reason, whether it be money or prestige or whatever the situation is. They already know there is a problem. But from 68 to now, the problem still is. And we still talking about saying that. And we still looking at it. But I remember, if I remember right, you can probably look at the documentary called Burning. Burning, the crazy name we use when you watch that documentary. You can see why I call Burning. And I think the issue was the Burning issue at that time. But you had people that had good intentions, but even though the good intentions, it still created a whole new issue, because you deal with people that thought different, that were different.
Thank you,
Like I
sir.
said, nothing really changed.
And referencing time, we are at time. And so I want to be mindful of our panelists who have given us their valuable time to be here today. That's an excellent point to end on. I ask us to think about what we've heard from our panelists that should catapult us into some new moments. Everything about what I've asked, the distinguished panel comment on what you've brought to the conversation is about how we can move differently going forward. So I just hope that you're encouraged to do so. Join me in thanking the panelists for their insight, their commentary, their information. I thank you for your questions, your insight, your commentary. Appreciate you being with us today. And let's make tomorrow better than today, and the day after that, better than tomorrow. And that's how we then get beyond being caught in time. Thank you so much again for being with us today.
Thank you all for I start my first back 3 years. There's still so love.
Sounds like playing basketball or something? No. Thank you so much. Yeah, such a hurry. Yeah. I get how it is. I get help.
Brother, I really appreciate it, man. I just let you get off.
I tell you, man, this is the one panelist I knew from the floor.
I got inspired from the when I read a lot of it. And the new Judeo-Christian, modern day Judeo-Christian girl, they teach you like supremacy within the church. They're the chosen people. So God smiled on them as part of that prosperity phase. So they're doing well because they're God's children. So everyone else is not. So their racism is it's God and God. We're better because God made us this way. That I don't know how to fight it. That's tough.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And I'll send you the link.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. Okay, yeah. Understood.
And over the years, it's starting to go. You know,
Promoting it more, but you know, it would be different once we could be there. I saw here, come on down, you know, I just saw somebody.
Are they recycling?
But they really, you know,
Are they recycling?
I think they are, you know,
Where?
so many people that it has a better chance of staying with it, you know, they have those, anyway. Thank you for your question and, you know, identifying yourself. I wish I could. And I am not, I am nothing in this one. I've been retired for years, you know. Go either way. COVID started as my part-time, you know, because I'm good at eating. Next.
Oh,
Right, to make you to sit down. It's that, it's got that kind of truth to it. I'm so glad to see the person. The last, I had notes, I carried this, I had another one that had notes from 2017 and 2018, the last. So, but actually, I took this one because I have notes. I'm not your Negro from the film. I watched it. I sat there in the cinema taking notes. I thought, I went crazy. But it was just so wonderful.
Yep. I'm Mellis. Oh, okay.
So it's got that energy. Oh, yeah. I've got.
Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it. If you've been anywhere, appreciate you coming here.
We can go in this direction. You can go, we're going in that direction.
Yes.